Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's FDU Alumni Webinar Series sponsored by the FDU Alumni Association and Office of Alumni Relations. As always, we thank you all for joining us, and we hope that everyone who did join us tonight is doing well and that you and your families are in good health during these difficult times. I want to take a moment to let everybody know that we are recording tonight's webinar. So for anyone who missed it, we will be posting it online, but just so that everyone here knows that it is being recorded. We also have muted all participants upon entry. We would kindly ask that you keep yourselves muted so that there's no distractions from our speaker tonight. After our presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. Many of the questions were submitted when people registered, so we will get to some of those questions. But if you have a question that comes up throughout the evening, please feel free to message it on the chat and we will add it to our questions list and get to as many as we can. For those of you who may not be familiar, if you hover your mouse down on the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little chat button. Click on that and that's where you type in any questions for later. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Karen Lewis, the Associate Vice President of University Advancement.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and we hope that you're practicing social distancing and safe tonight. Tonight's webinar is presented by the Alumni Association and the Office of Alumni Relations, and we're pleased that you're able to join us again. If you missed our presentation last week with Dr. Peter Woolley, Polling Fools and How and Why We Do It, as Jennifer mentioned, you can access that online on the alumni web pages. And we'd also like to express our gratitude to Dr. Woolley for his interactive and engaging presentation last Tuesday. And tonight we encourage everyone after our presentation with Dr. Dan Casino to complete a survey about the presentation to give us that wonderful feedback. And tonight's topic, masculinity, threat, and politics. Our presenter is Dan Casino, Associate Professor of Government and Law at Fairleigh Dickinson University and Director of Experimental Research for the Public Mind Poll. After finishing his doctorate in political economics at Stony Brook University, he did research at Princeton before coming to FDU in 2006. His work on how men's gender identities impacts their socio-political attitudes and behaviors has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other national media outlets. He is the co-author of several books, including his most recent Fox News in the American Politics and top-selling textbooks on social science research methodology. In addition to the academic journals pieces, he has written about politics, polling for gender for Newsweek and Harvard Business Review. He is also a frequent commentator on the radio and television outlets in New York, national and international media markets. We are pleased to have Dr. Dan Casino with us this evening as we explore masculinity, threat, and politics. Dan, we're gonna give you the floor and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Karen. So first off, it is great to be here. It's especially great to be here because normally this time of year, March and April, is when I'm doing lots of talks in the community. And for some reason, they all got canceled this year. I actually see Art Deegan's in the audience. So he's one of the people who I normally have talks with. And, you know, Art just canceled on me this year. I can't imagine why. So I'm here to talk about gender and gender identity and masculinity. And it's interesting being a male professor who studies gender because the assumption is that when we talk about gender, we're talking about women. And so I've actually given talks where at the end of the talk, I had people come up to me and say, wow, it was so great to hear about gender from a man because it means that you're unbiased. Because as a man, of course, I don't actually have gender, apparently. And of course, both men and women have gender. And I would argue that men's gender identities are way more interesting. And that's mostly because men are much, much weirder than women are. And we have to do more to protect our gender identities. And that leads us to more interesting behaviors. So the reason we see a difference here is that masculinity is something that in Western societies is largely earned rather than given. So if you think about it, most societies actually have a ceremony for when someone becomes a man, right? Think of a bar mitzvah, or if we were in Kenya, you might be hunting down a lion. So we have ceremonies to mark the passage into manhood, and ceremonies to mark passage into womanhood are comparatively rare. And this even shows up in our language, right? If I say, oh, he's not a real man, you know what I mean. If I say someone isn't a real woman, that doesn't quite have the same meaning. It's not clear. It almost sounds like I'm talking about something biological. Masculinity, men's gender identities, is something that men have to earn. And because they have to earn it, it can also be lost. It can be taken away. They can lose their masculinity. They can lose their gender identity. So to understand what this means and what this means for politics, we have to have some understanding of what masculinity is really about. So it's common to conflate gender and sex. And gender and sex are really very different things. So sex is more biological. Now, it's not completely biological, and it's much more complicated than I think a lot of people give it credit for. But sex is more biological, and gender is a social identity, like race or religion. It's a series of expectations that we have for ourselves and other people have for us about the way that we are supposed to behave. And it's something that is both internal, that is, we have our own expectations for what it means to be a Catholic, or what it means to be a man, or what it means to be white, or what it means to be Latino. And society also has expectations for us as to what that means. Now, for a lot of these social identities, like racial groups, this isn't such a big problem. It doesn't cause a lot of stress for people because, well, you're not really in very much danger often of losing your racial group or you losing your religious group. But men are oftentimes in danger of losing their gender identity, of not being seen or not seeing themselves as being real men. So what does it mean to be a man in modern America? Well, in modern America, there are three big pillars of masculinity. The first is fatherhood, that is having children, right? Being a father. The second is provision, that is the ability to take care of your family. And the third is protection, the ability to protect your family and to a lesser extent your community. Now, as you might see, these three build on each other. Part of being a good father is being able to provide for your family and provide for your children. Part of being a good father is protecting your family and your children and your community. These three main pillars of masculinity build on each other. They hold each other up. And so when one tumbles, when you lose the ability to fulfill your role as a man in one of these areas, it threatens your ability to fulfill your role as a man in all the other areas as well. And that really can cause a crisis for masculinity and for men's gender identities. Now, one of the things I study, and the basic way I study this, is I see what happens, how men react when this sense of when one of their masculine identities gets threatened, and see what they do to try and reinforce it. So masculinity is different than a lot of other gender identities in that masculinity, or gender identity in general, comes up a lot more often, is a lot more salient. So other gender identities are going to be things like race, all right? So is your race something you think about a lot? Well, for a lot of people, not really, right? Race becomes important, becomes salient only under certain circumstances. Similarly, your religion, right? So generally, I don't think about myself as a Catholic. It's not something I think about a lot. But if I'm in a situation where religion is important, right? If I'm at a funeral or a wedding, then suddenly my religion is important. It gets primed. It becomes more salient in that moment. If, as a white guy, when I go down to Miami to visit relatives, and I'm in a part of Miami where everyone's speaking Spanish all the time, and it's fine, I speak Spanish too, but now suddenly it's more salient to me that I'm a white guy. So race is salient, religion is salient, social identities become salient under different conditions. Gender is almost always salient. That is, whenever you interact with someone else, your gender and your gender relative to the other person's gender is really important. You speak to men differently than you speak to women. You move around men differently than the way you move around women. Men and women, even when they're alone, move and speak in very, very different ways. So your gender identity is different than race or religion or these other social identities to some extent because it's so often salient, because gender is shaping so much of the way we experience the world and the way we experience ourselves. So when masculinity, when your men's gender identity gets called into question, it can cause real problems because that gender identity is so salient, is so commonly being called into question. So what do we do when that gets called into question? When men feel like others think that they're not fulfilling one of these main gender roles? What they generally do is they double down. That is, they find some other aspect of masculinity that they are fulfilling, and they double down on that and they work on that, and they decide that's more important and they're going to do that instead. So give an example, a non-political example. Let's take a look at housework. So you may think, okay, housework is a pretty easy one. We know that men do less housework than women do, but we could explain this away perhaps by saying, well, that's because men earn more money than women do. So if we imagine a household where the man earns all the money and the woman doesn't earn any money, so Donna Reed sort of household. So if we imagine that household, we can understand that, okay, the man would probably do very little housework because he's earning all the money, and the wife does lots of housework because she's not earning any money. And then we say, okay, that seems relatively fair, but let's extend this forward. What if we reach a situation where the man and the woman, close to more modern households, where men and women earn about the same amount of money? Well, in that case, we'd expect that the man would do more housework and the woman would do less housework. And if they're each earning 50% of the income, they would each do about 50% of the housework. And that's what you'd expect. But that's not what happens. Why not? Well, up until you get to the point where the man is earning 50% of income, it works out pretty well. In fact, if you get to in American households where men and women earn about equal amounts of money, the men wind up doing about 40% of the housework, which I know is not equal, but it's about as close as you're gonna get with men. So we're gonna give them a pass on that. What's interesting is what happens when the man earns 45% of the income or 40% of the income, where he suddenly stops being the breadwinner and he's not making as much money as his spouse. What happens then? Well, we'd expect that the men would start doing more housework, right? They'd pick up the slack in the amount of housework. That's not actually what happens. In fact, what happens is that relative to men who make half of the income, men who make 40% of the income do less housework. And the less money they earn, the less housework they do. What's happening? Well, these men have had one of their major gender roles, provision, breadwinner. They've had that threatened. And they need to find some way to express their masculine identity, their gender. So what do? Well, they decide that some feminine tasks, let's say doing the dishes, are beneath them. They're not going to do that because that's not what men do. And they're saying, look, even if I'm not earning the money anymore, I'm not going to do the dishes, right? That's demeaning. That's feminine for them. So they do less housework. Now, what does that have to do with politics? The exact same impulses, the same factors that lead these men to do less housework also lead them to change their political views. That is, they identify something that they perceive to be feminine or insufficiently masculine. And once they've done that, then they say, I'm going to avoid that, or they double down on something they do consider to be masculine. And that extends from politics from housework to politics to all sorts of other behaviors. So a lot of the research I do basically involves taking men and scaring them, telling them or showing them or demonstrating them or making them think that their gender identity is being threatened, that they're not living up to what they themselves or what society expects them as a man. And then we see what they actually do with it. Other times we do this by looking at elements in society, that is, changes in society that have led more men to not be able to fulfill the gender roles. So a lot of the research I've done concentrates on the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, 2010, because that was a time when a lot of men lost their jobs before a lot of women did. And as a result, we can see what happens to those households where the men lose their jobs or lose a lot of income and the wives don't. Of course, later on in that recession, women did disproportionately lose their income, especially as a result of austerity measures by state and local governments. So what does this mean for politics? How does this work out in the political world? Well, one way we can look at this is to look at the 2016 presidential election. there's actually been a resurgence in studies of masculinity in social science, I think largely because of what happened in 2016. Because 2016 was an election that was very much about gender. Now, it was to some extent about sex. That is, it was about Hillary Clinton, a female candidate, and Donald Trump, a male candidate. But Hillary Clinton was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a female candidate who was considered to be very, very feminine. In fact, a lot of the reasons people said they didn't like Hillary Clinton, and a lot of people did not like her for reasons that are good or not so good. But a lot of the reasons people didn't like Hillary Clinton was because they didn't perceive her to be appropriately feminine. She was too assertive. She wasn't nice enough, right? Now, no one ever accused male politicians, said male politicians had to be nice, but female politicians are held to a different standard. And Hillary Clinton was held to a different standard. She wasn't considered to be sufficiently feminine, and that made people not like her. Donald Trump, on the other hand, made a lot of appeals directly to masculinity. Now, Donald Trump himself is not, I think by any stretch of the imagination, a really macho guy. He's not a sportsman. He's not any of these other things we associate with machismo. But he does make a lot of appeals to masculinity. And part of that is appeals against femininity. That is, making the argument that men should be dominant in society, making the argument that women should be judged on appearance and judged on traditionally feminine traits rather than trying to make it in a man's world. As he said when he divorced his first wife, that his first wife had gotten a job, and once she got a job, all the desire for her drained out of him. So we have an election that is about gender roles. And what we found is that men, especially in the wake of the 2008 to 2010 recession, a lot of men were still feeling like they were not fulfilling gender roles. They weren't being good men, that men were being disadvantaged in society. In fact, President Trump said this during the campaign, that the only advantage Hillary Clinton had was that she had the woman card, and she was trying to get people to elect her because she was a woman. Now, of course, people who study politics will tell you that it's actually a little bit harder for women to be elected than for men. But the argument was that men were being disadvantaged in some way. So we ran an experiment. We did an experiment, which is embedded in a normal telephone poll in New Jersey. We randomly selected half of the respondents to be told that there are a lot of households in the United States in which women earn more than men. And then asked them, well, what about your household? Do you earn more, or does your spouse earn more, or is it about the same? Now, we don't ask this question because we trust the results. We know people lie about this. And the reason we know is that we know from census data and from Bureau of Economic Indicators data, we know that about 38% of married American couples have situations where the wife earns more than the husband does. In surveys, only about 15% of men say their wife earns more than they do. So we know half the people are lying. The whole point of this question is actually to work as a prime. That is, we're trying to scare them. And we scare them, and then if we scare them, we see exactly how they respond to that fear. So what happens? Well, after we ask them about their relative earnings, we then go ahead and ask them about how they're going to vote in the election. So in this case, we actually, again, had a manipulation. That is, for half of the respondents, were first asked how they would vote if the election were between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Half the response were asked how they vote if the election was between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Then we, of course, after that, whichever matchup you got the other one. And then the people who hadn't initially been assigned to be told about women earning more money than men, then got that question, just to make sure everything evened out. And that lets us figure out what the effects are of asking this question, of scaring men in this way. So I've got a graph here so you can see what this looks like. So we've got the gender prime conditions. Gender prime means we scared them, right? We told them women earn more money than men. How about you? That is calling to question these men's role as providers. And we see that the blue bar, right? Blue bar is support for Sanders. And well, it doesn't actually have much of an effect, right? When we're looking at Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump, it doesn't make too much of a difference, right? Men, gender prime, no gender prime. Women, gender prime, no gender prime. It doesn't matter too much. But we get a very different outcome if we do the same thing with Hillary Clinton. That is, when we bring up Hillary Clinton, what we see is this bar that shows the effect of gender priming on men. Suddenly, Hillary Clinton gets a lot less popular, and Donald Trump gets a lot more popular. Now, what we're seeing here is that bringing up gender prime, threatening men with a loss of male privilege or a loss of masculinity, that leads them to support Donald Trump, but only if Donald Trump is running against Hillary Clinton, a woman. That is, it leads them to like a man more only relative to a woman. It doesn't do anything if we're looking at the effect of the matchup with Bernie Sanders. These men, we scare them, and they're looking to compensate, just as they are by looking to compensate by not doing dishes. They're looking to compensate in this case by not voting for Hillary Clinton or saying that they support Donald Trump. We see this also on a lot of other political issues. It's not limited to just support for female candidates. Indeed, it's the American political system, while it doesn't have sex, it does have gender. Americans, by and large, see the Democratic Party as being more feminine than the Republican Party. Now, that's silly, of course, right? The fact that political parties don't have sex, right? They're not male or female, right? There's no reason to assign gender to them. And in fact, in many countries, they don't really seem to be gendered, but in the United States, they are. Our political parties are gendered, and so too are issues. Healthcare is considered to be a feminine issue. The defense is considered to be a masculine issue. So we've gendered parties and issues. And just as individuals men, when they're threatened, can express their masculine identity by favoring one candidate over another, they can also do it by favoring one political issue over another or expressing a certain view on certain political issues. So for instance, when men lose their jobs, controlling for everything else, when men lose their jobs or lose income relative to their wives, they become less supportive of abortion rights, right? This is seen as a feminine issue. This is something men are saying, oh, well, I can express my masculinity by saying I'm against abortion. They also become more opposed to welfare, especially welfare and any social program that seem to benefit African Americans and other racial minority groups. That is, they see that as being a feminine thing to do, right? Social welfare is a feminine thing. And since it's feminine, they're not going to do it, right? They're going to express their masculinity by not supporting these political issues. So it's not just that they change their views on candidates, which might be something to be limited to when you've got a woman running for election, but it's also something that affects their views on these very broad political issues about welfare and healthcare and defense spending. These same men then become, when they're threatened, become more likely to support increases in defense spending. So we get these big shifts in political views. And these shifts are relatively large. So we're talking about a shift of about 0.5 point on a 7-point scale, which doesn't sound like much, but major life events like getting divorced or having children typically have an effect on the range of about 0.25 point. So losing income relative to your wife, if you're a man, makes you express your masculinity. The change in your views is twice as much as if you had a baby or got divorced or had some other major life change. So it's a pretty big shift. And these men are doing it because they've lost income, because they're not able to fulfill that role as, in this case, breadwinners. Now, the other roles also are important, right? So we find when men lose their ability to, when men find that they cannot have children, so they can't fulfill the role as father, they take similar compensatory measures. And when men feel they're not protecting their family. So we see this oftentimes when we talk to men who have been the victims of crimes, whose families have been the victims of crimes. They will have similar effects. But for the most part, we deal with what happens when men lose income because that's easier to measure because the government's very good about measuring income. Now, this doesn't stop at just these reactions that people have on surveys. And this is a lot of pushback I get from these results is saying, well, this is just people talking. That is, sure, men are saying these things, but they're doing that to demonstrate their masculinity. The Masculinity Act isn't actually being more conservative or voting for Donald Trump. It's just saying you're going to. They want to demonstrate to the interviewer, oftentimes who's a woman, much more than a man, that they're going to do this. So to show this is really happening, we should try and link this back to real world activities, right? As something aside from just survey responses. In my research, I do this by looking at the effect of masculinity and gender identity threat on men's purchases of guns. So what are we doing here? Well, gun purchases are actually a little hard to track. They're hard to track because while the federal government actually does collect data on what guns are sold, by law, they are not allowed to disperse that data to anyone. So there's a rider in every budget bill that goes through Congress that says the ATF is not allowed to spend any money to actually tell people which guns are being sold. So we're not allowed to know that. But we are allowed to look at FBI background checks. That's publicly released data. And we can look at FBI background checks and find out what the change is in FBI background checks over time. And we actually have monthly data on this for every single state going back to the late 1990s when the FBI background check system was first introduced. So when we do that, we can link that up with the trends in various states. We can find those states and those households in which men have lost income relative to their wives. Again, income data, government does a pretty good job of collecting it. And we take a look at that, what we find is that first off, in the times where men are economically suffering more than women, and especially where married men who live with their wives are suffering more than women are. Well, when we look at that, we see that those are the times that correspond to a dramatic increase in the number of guns that are being sold. Well, how many guns are we talking about? Well, the guns we're talking, the amount is pretty substantial. So today, we expect generally on the order of about 1.8 million federal background checks to be carried out per month. It's a lot. When the system was started, it was closer to 500,000 a month. We're about 1.8 million background checks per month now. Well, if the unemployment rate for married men living with their spouses goes up more by 1 point than the unemployment rate for married women living with their spouses. So think about that. That means we're looking at just at households now where men have lost their jobs and women have not, because assuming heterosexual couples, every married man who's living with a spouse is living with a married woman who's living with a spouse. If that difference gets to 1%, every month we see an extra 75,000 guns sold in the United States, or an extra 75,000 background checks that actually translate into more than 75,000 guns. The reason for that is that you need one background check for however many guns you're going to buy, and the mean number of guns you're buying with that is about 1.4. So we say 75,000 background checks, we're looking at somewhere on the order of about 120,000 actual guns being sold in a month, extra on top of what we normally get. During the Great Recession, that number wasn't just 1%, that number reached briefly as much as 3%, corresponding to about an extra 300,000 guns being sold per month. It's a shocking number. Now, this is something that actually is not a historical fact, because this is actually going on right now. We'll talk about this at the end. This is one of the responses we've seen to COVID-19. The early onset of COVID-19 layoffs have disproportionately hit men over women. Women are much more likely to be considered to be essential personnel. They're working in jobs that are not being shut down. And as a result, men are now more employed than women are. And as a consequence, we saw a dramatic increase for the month of March, even when this was first starting, in the number of guns being sold. So this is real world behavior. And the reason we track this is because this is something we can actually verify. This isn't just people saying something in a survey. This is actually people going on buying guns. Now, of course, they also say it in surveys. We ask them if they own a gun. They become more likely to say it. They own a gun if we first prime them to think about gender identity. We also find that they become more likely to report owning a gun. But this isn't just talking, because they're also more likely to actually go out and buy a gun, as we can measure in the FBI background check data. This sort of behavior extends outside of the household and outside and even to things that can be very destructive for men. So we see this also goes along with increases in violent crime, especially crime against women. When we look at eras where men are being disadvantaged relative to their wives, violent crime, especially violent crime against women, increases, especially in states that are hardest hit by this. Now, what's interesting about the guns and the violent crime results, and one of the reasons I bring them up, is it shows the extent to which all of this is contextual. That is, here in New Jersey, where we are, I think where most of us are, gun ownership is actually not terribly common. New Jersey is some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. So while long guns, rifles are, for hunting, still relatively common, handguns and other sort of rifles are not very common at all. And as a result, what we see is that because handguns are not very common, it's not considered to be a way to express your masculinity. That is, men in New Jersey don't buy guns in response to gender identity threat nearly as much as men in other states where guns are more common. If we go to states where guns are very common, Texas, Wyoming, then they are much more likely, they're responding much more strongly in terms of gun purchases to masculinity threat than people in New York or New Jersey, where guns are less common. We see the same thing with crime rates. That is, the crime, it goes up more in states that already have higher rates of crime against women. That is, men are looking to display their masculinity, but they can only do so, it only works as a display if other men and themselves recognize it as a display of masculinity. So here in New Jersey, owning a gun is not going to be a way for me to demonstrate masculinity because other people aren't going to recognize it as such, because not a lot of men do. Where if we're in Georgia or Wyoming, then that's going to matter a lot more because there's simply more guns around. Similarly, crime against women goes up more in states where crime against women is already seen as a way to express masculinity, as destructive as that may be. So it's not just that men are saying things on surveys. It's not just that men are doing things like buying guns, or in other studies, buying pickup trucks or large SUVs. They're actually engaging in potentially catastrophic behavior for themselves and others by committing violent crimes. I've published similar results on sexual harassment. As we look at sexual harassment in the workplace, these same indicators, when men lose their jobs or men lose income relative to wives, the areas where men are suffering more relative to women are the areas that see the biggest increase in sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, this isn't even because the men who are losing their jobs are sexually harassing people in the workplace because they're not in the workplace, but rather it's other men who see that they feel like their role as men, their dominance as men is being threatened. They act out, especially act out against women in the workplace, and have increasing levels of sexual harassment. So all of these are linked, right? All these phenomena are linked because they're all ways in which men are trying to demonstrate their gender identities. They find that they're not able to assert their gender identities the way they're used to. And so they find some other way to do it. And those ways are, and many of the times we talk about here, either socially neutral, like voting for one candidate over another, or they can be socially destructive, like engaging in sexual harassment or violent crime, or even just not doing the dishes. But I don't want to leave you on a down note, because it's not all bad news. There's actually some pretty good news here. The best news is that masculinity, while it's a very strong impulse for men, masculinity is also very, very adaptable. It's malleable. And so to show you how that is, let's talk a little about cooking. So cooking is traditionally considered to be a very feminine activity, right? It's something women did, especially everyday cooking for the family. But that's changed in the last 10 to 15 years. Why did it change? Well, first off, there was always a space for men to do cooking. That is, there was always a space for men to say, well, cooking might be a feminine activity, but if we're cooking outside over an open fire, well, that's masculine, of course. If we're cooking for special events, special occasion, like a turkey on Thanksgiving, that's masculine. If we're cooking on a barbecue, that's masculine. So there's certain types of cooking, especially of pieces of meat or for special occasions or outside, there's certain things that are considered masculine. So what happened? Well, we got a shift in the culture. That is, we saw a shift in the way food was being portrayed, mostly on television. That is, if you look at cooking shows before about 2004, the cooking shows were almost entirely staffed by women. It was women preparing food and showing you how to do it. Cook shows. After 2004, and actually as a result of the enormous success of a Japanese game show called Iron Chef in the United States, cooking competition shows became the norm. Food Network today doesn't actually show the old style cooking shows. It doesn't show Julia Child's cooking shows. It shows cooking competition shows. And the cooking competition shows, the competitors are almost entirely men. They're cooking big pieces of meat or crazy food, and they're competing to do it. And if you don't cook it right, you lose. And it's a failure of skill or a failure of nerve, a failure of risk-taking. So now cooking moves from ways portrayed as being something you do at home to take care of the family, something you do to demonstrate your competence, your skill, your risk-taking ability. So what happens? Men start cooking more. Now, how do they square with masculinity, right? If cooking is a feminine activity, how can they make it a masculine one? Well, you can bring it in there because, of course, cooking wasn't always just feminine. It was masculine if it was a special occasion or if it was over fire, if we had a lot of meat. So what do? You decide that every night is going to be a night where we're going to have a special event. We're going to do something crazy, some big meal every night, something that shows off skill and competence and risk-taking. You also cook more with meat, and we actually saw an increase in meat consumption, especially consumption of things like bacon and fatback, which is just more bacon. It's a little troubling. So men were able to adapt to masculinity. Now, they're also able to, in turn, cooking, a traditionally feminine activity, into a masculine one. And we're seeing some of that also with other behaviors. So I said one of the big foundations of American masculinity is fatherhood. And we actually are seeing over the past 20 years, men reporting spending much more time taking care of their children. So essentially we're seeing more house husbands. Men who say, well, I'm not earning a living, right? I'm not the breadwinner of the household, but I can fix that by doubling down on some other behavior. In this case, the behavior is parenting. Parenting, being a good father, is a big part of what it means to be a man in America. And so I can double down on that behavior. And that actually leads me to assert myself as a man in that way, in a different way than I would be doing otherwise. So I can assert my masculinity in a way that's more socially positive. Last thing I want to talk about, so the way we see this we see this in politics, plays out when we see polarization among men. That is, in general, on average, when men have their gender identity threatened, they become more conservative. They hold more conservative views, they hold more anti-abortion views, more anti-gay views, and more anti-welfare views and anti-healthcare access views. But that's an average. In fact, when you dig a little deeper in the data, what we see is that men aren't actually getting more conservative, they're actually getting more polarized. That is, conservative men, and especially conservative men in areas that are already conservative, become more conservative. But liberal men, or men living in areas that are already relatively liberal, like New York or New Jersey, actually become more liberal. So what we see is that some men are responding to a threat to the masculinity by saying, well, I don't like gays now, or I'm going to put more emphasis on the fact that I think abortion is wrong. We have other men who would face the same threat and say, oh, well, now I'm going to worry about being an ally to women and to women's groups. In fact, oftentimes we see them doubling down so much they're taking leadership roles in feminist organizations, which presents its own set of problems, because if you've got an organization devoted to empowering women and it winds up being run by men, I'm not sure what exactly we're doing here. But the point is not that one of these is more desirable than the others. Rather, the point is that men are increasingly able to shape their own masculinity. We're able to find ways, aside from the cultural norm, to express that masculine gender identity in ways that might be, in the end, much more positive for society, focusing on things like fatherhood, or helping minority groups and women, and that we might not have done in the past. Last thing I want to mention here, before we turn it over to question and answer, is I want to talk a little about what's going on right now with COVID-19. I've already published some work on this, but there are good signs and bad signs. So let's start with the bad. The bad signs are that when you scare men and you say your family is not protected, right? There's a virus going around, your family isn't protected, we expect men are going to double down. And indeed, we see that in the data. That is, so if we look at men's rate of hand washing, men during COVID-19 in March and April of this month are less likely to report that they're actually washing their hands frequently, which is bad. Everyone should be washing their hands. But why are they less likely than women to be doing that? Well, a lot of it has to do with threat. That is, when men feel a little bit threatened, they say, oh, there's a little bit of threat of COVID-19, not too bad. They actually become more likely to wash their hands. When they get really threatened, that is when their role as a protector, as a provider, because of economic threat is called into question, when they get really scared, they become less likely to wash their hands. They double down on their masculine identity by saying, I'm fine, I'm tough, I don't need to do it. And that's a problem. However, we also see some positive signs that was going on in COVID-19. That is, the amount of time spent by men at home is going up, which means the amount of time they're spending on taking care of their children is going up as well. Now, we don't expect that to last forever. Eventually, I hope, we're all going to go back to work. But what we find with childcare is that childcare as an activity is actually really, really sticky. That is, once you start doing more of it for any reason, you tend to keep on doing more of it. You build up routines, you build up activities that you do with your child. And so the fact that men are spending more time home, even though women are putting more time into daycare during the day than men are right now, the fact that men are spending any more time on daycare is likely to stick around with us for a long time, simply because we are getting they are going to build up those sort of sticky behaviors. Now, what's the effect of COVID-19 on politics and the threat men are facing? Well, to some extent, we generally expect that when the economy goes poorly, the president's going to be blamed at the ballot box. So most political economists will tell you that the second quarter of a presidential election year is the most important for president's fate. If the economy is doing badly, then the president's probably going to not be reelected. But the other thing we would say here is that President Trump does seem to be different. His approval ratings haven't suffered very much as a result of, his approval ratings haven't gone up as a result of the economy being good. So it's not likely they'll go down that much because the economy is doing badly. Also, COVID-19 is almost tailor-made to engender threat in men, especially gender identity threat. They're not able to earn money. They're not able to protect their families. And that could lead to a lot of men doubling down by deciding they like President Trump, a more masculine character, even more. All right, I think that's the time I was supposed to talk about. And so now I think Karen or Jen is going to have some questions. So I'm happy to take whatever questions you got.
All right, great. Thank you again, Professor Casino, for such an informative presentation about the masculinity threat in politics. Certainly offered a lot of insight and things to think about. Let's move on to the Q&A portion of the night. So our first question comes from Dr. Diane Clark Cudless. She's an alumna, 1981, Rutherford.
All right, Rutherford.
How does religion and masculinity relate? I live in South Carolina, and the religious doctrine regarding masculinity is strong.
Yeah, this is actually a fascinating topic. The book I've got coming out in the fall about masculinity, we actually have a whole chapter on religion. Because religion is actually another way, I didn't talk about here, is actually another way that men can double down on their gender identity. So a lot of religious organizations, a lot of religious affiliations, especially evangelical and born-again Christianity, really stress the dominance of men. And as a result, we see in areas where those are common, especially where you are in the American South, and where those denominations are popular, we actually see men, when they're threatened, actually become more religious. That goes along with political views, right? It has a lot of political ramifications. But we actually see a dramatic increase in the number of men who say that they are born again or evangelical and talk about very traditionalist Christian values. Things like believing that God is a man, that God intended only for heterosexual intercourse, all sorts of these very, as a Northeastern Catholic, they seem kind of old-fashioned to me, but these are religious doctrines and religious affiliations that people double down on. So it absolutely is a way of expressing masculinity. And actually, in a lot of those groups where you are, you will see men's encounter groups where they talk about how men can be more Christ-like and be, as men. So the idea is there are religious groups there that are trying to figure out a way to create a more positive masculinity rather than anti-woman masculinity, a masculinity that instead is about trying to be more Christ-like, taking care of your family in a certain way. Very good question, like that.
Thank you. Now the next question is from John Cahill. He's an alumnus, class of 2015.
Okay.
Does the level of language used during a campaign rally make a difference for men or women, like fear tactics or simplistic language?
So there's not a lot of data on this, honestly. So there is some notion that fear works better on men than it works on women. That is, fear is more likely to engender threat, which is more likely to engender these sort of gender identity responses in men than among women. And we do see a difference in the way the candidates talk and the rhetoric they use. The problem is that we can't really separate that out from the sex of the candidates. That is, female candidates are much less likely to use threatening language than male candidates are. So it's not quite clear if it's the message or if it's the messenger.
Great, thank you. Similar topic. This is from Marcia Haddock, an alumna from 1982. Does Trump speak to threatened males?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's not just about the sort of individual level gender identity threat I've been talking about. There is this larger pattern of men in the United States believing that they are being discriminated against. Now, okay, let's be honest. The idea that men in the United States face discrimination on the whole is kind of ridiculous. I'm a guy. We still own everything. We have an unbeaten 45-0 streak on the presidency. We're 80% of this House and the Senate. 99 out of the Fortune 100. So we're still running everything, right? But we started asking this question around 2014 in major national surveys about whether men feel to be discriminated against because of their gender. And there's a lot of men out there who think that they are facing problems, right? That they're being discriminated against because they see, because they believe that any gain for women is necessarily a problem for men. So if abortion rights, for instance, is something that helps women, and they see that as something that hurts men because it helps women. They have this sort of zero-sum view of gender relationships. and also of other relationships like racial relationships or other things. So they see this as zero-sum view. And it also works as almost an excuse, right? So if you're in Ohio and the plant shut down, all these people the New York Times talks to in diners, well, you're looking for some reason why you're not able to make the living that your parents or your grandparents were. And the reason for that might be, you might say immigration, but you also might say, no, it's because white men can't get a fair shake anymore. White heterosexual Christian men can't get a fair shake anymore. And that's what Donald Trump, I think, was really speaking to, saying this country used to be great, right? When white heterosexual Christian men were in charge, and now it's not, right? These men are being discriminated against. The woman card is being played against men. That white people, and men, especially white men, are the ones facing discrimination now. And we need to get rid of these social programs and that they would argue are reverse discrimination in order to support those men. Now, he's certainly got a point, right? There are a large portion of American men who have been left behind, and our society is not doing very much to take care of them. And neither political party has done much to take care of them. President Trump really did hit on something very true when he talked to those men. And those men are the ones that are perceived as are really feeling the threat. Now, what I think is important to take away from this is that a lot of people do look when, so we talk about economic anxiety, and that's related to what I'm talking about, the idea that men are anxious because they lost their breadwinner role. And people say, oh, well, it can't be economic anxiety that's causing people to do things that might be considered racist or sexist. Well, that's not economic anxiety, but what I want to tell you is that it's all economic anxiety. That gender anxiety is economic anxiety, right? Economic anxiety plays out in gender. Economic anxiety plays out in race relations. It plays out in all these social roles as men seek to assert themselves. So he is playing on anxiety, and I think to a great extent on masculine anxiety. And I think that was decisive for him in 2016 because he was running against a woman, especially a woman who was considered to be not traditionally feminine. Wouldn't have worked against any candidate, right? So Sarah Palin was a woman, a female candidate who was perceived as being traditionally feminine. So those sort of attacks wouldn't necessarily work against her. She wasn't threatening to men, but Hillary Clinton was definitely perceived as being very threatening to men.
Great, thank you. Another great question, which I think is a bit of a follow-up to the question that we just answered. Since many countries have had women leaders, is this more of an American phenomenon?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that, first off, most of the countries that have had women leaders, right? So talk all these European countries that have women leaders. For the most part, those women leaders, the initial ones elected, were actually elected as parliamentary leaders. So if I'm in a parliamentary system, so Finland, for instance, or Sweden, yeah, they've had female leaders, but they weren't directly elected by the public. So the equivalent for that is Nancy Pelosi, right? We've had a female Speaker of the House, but Nancy Pelosi is not the president. And so countries that have a direct election of the president actually are much less likely to support women. I do think there is something, though, about American masculinity that's different than the way masculinity is defined in European countries. There is this sort of frontier mentality we have here that doesn't necessarily exist in a lot of European countries, and I think that does get in the way. I think also the fact that we have the two-party system rather than a multi-party system does make it more difficult because it means there are fewer role models. Look, at the end of the day, the way to stop discrimination against women running for office is to just have so many women running for office that nobody cares anymore. That becomes unremarkable. And if you've got a big multi-party system, then you have a lot more female candidates. People get used to it quicker. And we haven't had that in the United States because we only have two parties.
Great. I think we probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So the next question, what are the possible implications of Joe Biden selecting a woman as a running mate? Do you think it will hurt or help?
I think it will make basically no difference at all. I think it'll be important symbolically. I think it's a way for Biden to reach out to women who were very supportive of Hillary Clinton and say, look, I'm on your side. I'm also a feminist in some sense. But the truth of the matter is nobody really cares about the vice president. Vice presidential picks sometimes help a little bit. The best estimate is it gets you about 1 to 2 extra percentage points in the vice presidential candidate's home state. And sometimes they hurt. Right? If you pick a bad one, it can really sink your candidacy, right? John McCain probably lost some points for having Sarah Palin on the ticket with him. But in general, 1 or 2 points in one state is about as much as you're going to expect. Might be nice symbolically, but I think that's about it. Now, I would say, whether help or hurt in the election, Joe Biden's vice presidential pick as the oldest person to ever, if he wins, he'd be the oldest person ever elected for a first term. His vice president's probably important, especially as a global pandemic's going around. We'll make sure to get someone who's well qualified in the vice presidential seat.
Great. Thanks. And I forgot to mention that that particular question was from our alumnus, Mark Sapara, class of
Oh,
91.
Mark. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark. How are you? Next question. This is from Abby Therese, and she's a student at FDU. Is there anything specific that has changed or evolved that makes men feel attacked? Or is it the changes being made to reach true equality in general that are causing them to feel this way?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, all right. So let's do this by metaphor, right? So in the classrooms, especially elementary school classrooms, in co-ed elementary school classrooms, you find that boys talk about 2/3 of the time. Girls only talk about 1/3 of the time. And so there were a lot of efforts to try and fix this, to get girls to talk more. So what happens? Well, you put all these interventions in to make sure girls talk just as much as boys do. And when that happens, the boys in the class start complaining. They tell you, this isn't fair. The girls are talking too much. Why? Well, because if you've been on top for a long time, then movements towards equality feel like discrimination, right? And so men still, we own everything. But as we move towards equality, as we take these baby steps towards equality, towards women and men being on equal playing field, well, now that starts to feel like discrimination to those men. And that's partially why they're feeling threatened. Also, look, white men, especially white, used to have a lot of privilege that they don't have anymore, right? You had privilege over women because you were a man. You had privilege over non-whites because you were white. That privilege doesn't exist to the same extent it did. And it doesn't help you, especially economically, as much as it did in the past. And that's a threat to men, especially to older men who feel like I've had this privilege and now I'm losing it. Something changed. It's not me. Got to be something in society.
Great, thank you. And our last question, I think is really appropriate to be our final question, as it kind of talks a little bit about the future of where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
And this question is from Maureen Norton, who's a friend of FDU. Do you think that these trends will be different for millennials and Gen Z?
Yeah, I actually really do. So we actually see the definition of masculinity is very different. So these sort of alternate masculinities, right? So men of every generation are doing the same thing because they've been doing it for hundreds of years, right? The idea that men are going to try and define their masculinity. When it's threatened in some way, they're going to double down some activity they think they can get at. Okay. But as we said, masculinity is incredibly adaptable. And that means that we've got these new generations of men who are finding different ways of expressing their masculinity. That is, they don't have to express masculinity by buying guns and sexually harassing women. They're finding other ways of expressing masculinity. And part of that is through leadership. Part of that, I've actually seen really interesting work on fashion, the way they're dressing. Oh, I'm going to be super fashionable. I'm going to be hot, right? I'm going to exercise more. These are different ways of expressing masculinity that are potentially more socially desirable. We also see among younger men, so men 25 and under, the ones that have children are way more involved as fathers than their father's generation or their grandparents' generation. And that's, again, a very positive view. Now, we don't know yet because the data is not in yet. So your oldest millennials now are, well, they're my age, they're a little shy of 40. So the oldest millennials are a little shy of 40. So we don't have great data on them yet. But millennials in general, millennial men are way more involved in parenting, and they do define masculinity in different ways. That is, however, still highly regional. That is, men in New York are very, very different than men in Texas and men in Wyoming and men in Arizona. And so we have to bear that in mind, that there's not one American masculinity, there's a lot of them. But I would say that urban American male masculinity among young men is very different than what it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Great, thank you. So that was our last question. So thank you again, Professor Dan Casino. We really appreciated you being with us tonight. And I want to thank everybody one more time for attending tonight's webinar. Please keep an eye out for a follow-up email. If you registered, you'll be receiving an email tonight so we can ask you for some feedback on tonight's presentation, as well as some future topics you may be interested in seeing. I do want to say thank you one more time, and on behalf of FDU's Alumni Association and the Office of Alumni Relations, everybody please stay safe, stay healthy, and keep washing your hands. And thank you again, Dan. Have a good night, everybody.